Have you ever wondered what it truly means to follow God's commands even when they seem impossible? Sometimes God calls us to do things that are difficult, things that don't make sense to the world around us. One of the most powerful examples of this is the story of Hosea, a prophet in the Bible. God asked him to marry a prostitute, a woman named Gomer, and to love her despite her unfaithfulness. It's a story that challenges us to think deeply about obedience, love, and what it means to trust God above everything else. Through Hosea's life, we see that sometimes God's greatest plans are revealed in the most unexpected ways. Imagine Hosea, a man chosen by God to be a prophet, receiving the shocking command to marry a woman with a known reputation. It wasn't just about the pain of marrying someone who lived a life so opposite to his own, but it was about how Hosea would have felt knowing the life she was continuing to live even as his wife. God asked him to do something incredibly hard, to love someone who would continually betray him. We live in a world where reputation, image, and opinions matter. People often hesitate to follow God's call because they fear what others will think. But Hosea's story encourages us to put God's opinion above all else. It's not about what others say, it's about what God sees. Hosea showed that faithfulness to God is more important than the approval of people. The world may criticize or judge, but ultimately it is God's voice that matters most. Can you imagine how Hosea may have felt when he first heard God's command? Here he was, a righteous man, someone who likely had a reputation in his community, now called to marry someone who was living in open sin. It must have been confusing, maybe even humiliating. Hosea could have questioned God's wisdom, as many of us would, but he did not. He chose to trust God's plan, even though it seemed impossible to understand at the time. This speaks volumes about his faith. He believed that God's purpose for his life was greater than his own understanding. Imagine if God asked you to marry a sex worker. How would you feel? Would you be willing to obey even if it seemed confusing? Or would you hesitate because of the judgment of others? Sometimes God's commands can feel difficult or even painful, but they carry a deeper purpose. We can only imagine what Hosea's friends and family may have said behind his back. They would have questioned his judgment, perhaps tried to talk him out of it, and maybe even ridiculed him for choosing such a prostitute as a wife. It's one thing to obey God in private, but Hosea's obedience was out in the open, where everyone could see and judge. His choice of a wife would have seemed scandalous, even reckless. But sometimes, when God calls us to do something, it doesn't make sense to others. What matters is that we are obedient to God's voice, just like Hosea was. Gomer, the woman Hosea married, did not change her ways just because she got married. She continued in her lifestyle, chasing after other men, even while fully married to Hosea. This must have been heart-wrenching for him. How many times did Hosea come home to find his wife missing, knowing she was with another man? Despite this, he stayed committed to her, and more than that, he loved her. Hosea's love for Gomer was not dependent on her behavior. It was a reflection of the love God has for his people, a love that remains steadfast even when we are unfaithful. Their children added another layer of complexity to the situation. Some of the children Gomer bore may not have even been Hosea's, but the children of the men she had affairs with. Yet Hosea took them in, loved them, and raised them as his own. This is a beautiful picture of grace, taking in and loving someone not because of what they have done or deserve, but because of an unshakable commitment. Hosea's heart may have been heavy, knowing these children may not have been his, yet he chose to love them all the same. God used Hosea's life to show Israel and us what it looks like to love someone who constantly turns away. Just like Gomer betrayed Hosea, the people of Israel were unfaithful to God, chasing after other idols. And just as Hosea kept loving Gomer, God keeps loving us despite our failures, our betrayals, and our unfaithfulness. Hosea's story is a mirror of God's never-ending love and pursuit of his people. Even when Gomer left Hosea for other men, he did not give up on her. There was a moment when Hosea had to pay money to buy Gomer back, almost like redeeming her from slavery. This act is profound because it shows that love is not just a feeling, it's a choice, a commitment. Hosea could have walked away, but instead he went after her, paid the price, and brought her back home. This reflects the heart of God, who paid the ultimate price, Christ on the cross, to bring us back to him, even when we did not deserve it. Hosea's story teaches us that love is about more than feelings. It's about sacrifice, endurance, and unwavering commitment. Imagine how hard it must have been for him to keep going after Gomer, to keep forgiving her, to keep loving her despite everything she did. But through Hosea's life, God was teaching the world about his own relentless love, a love that never gives up, no matter how many times we fail. In our own lives, there are times when God may ask us to do something that doesn't make sense to us, something that feels too hard or too painful. Hosea's life shows us that sometimes the hardest things we are asked to do are the things that will reveal the greatest truth about God's love. Hosea's obedience, even in the face of heartache, glorified God and showed the world what real love looks like. His life was a living testimony of God's unconditional love for us, a love that chases after us even when we run away, and redeems us no matter how far we've gone. And just like Hosea, we are called to love others, not because they deserve it, but because God has loved us first. Obeying God isn't always easy, especially when it goes against societal norms or what people think is right. Hosea's decision to marry Gomer would have been viewed with scandal and shock, but he wasn't concerned about pleasing people. He was focused on pleasing God. This raises a question for all of us. Are we more worried about what the world think of us, or are we committed to following God's direction for our lives, no matter how strange or uncomfortable it seems? True obedience sometimes requires stepping into situations that make no sense to those around us. But when we trust God, we know His plan has a greater purpose. How far can we go in obeying God's commands? Are we willing to risk our reputation, our comfort, or even our heart to fulfill His will? In Hosea's case, his obedience to God's command to marry Gomer wasn't about him. It was about God's message of love and redemption. Hosea's life became a powerful symbol of God's unrelenting love for His people, even when they turned away from Him. It shows that sometimes our obedience is about more than just us. It's about revealing God's heart to the world. God's ways are sometimes hard to understand, but they always carry a purpose. Hosea obeyed not because it was easy, but because he trusted God. Through his life, we learn that true love and obedience to God often requires sacrifice, humility, and a willingness to step into difficult situations. But when we do, we reflect the heart of God, a heart that loves unconditionally, pursues relentlessly, and never gives up, no matter the cost. True obedience to God often requires stepping out in faith, even when it's hard and doesn't make sense. In the end, it's God's opinion that truly matters. When we trust Him, we reflect His love, His grace, and His faithfulness. Just like Hosea, we are called to love, to obey, and to trust that God's ways, though sometimes difficult, always have a deeper purpose. Let Hosea's story inspire us to live with that same courage and commitment to God's will. Thank you for watching, and may God bless you.